Representation in gaming has been under the microscope the last decade and change, with gamers looking to see more and more diversity in the heroes and villains presented. While such a thing has never been a deciding factor in playing a game for me personally, there is a bit of a noticeable issue in a genre near and dear to my heart. Find out more in today's chapter. What's up, scholars? Moira here, and welcome to Book of Showtime Chapter 71. As always, if you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like and share with your friends, and if you have a topic you'd like for me to cover for Book of Showtime, be sure to leave it in the comment section down below, or anywhere you can reach me on social media or the Book of Showtime Discord. So if you've been around for some of the Book of Showtime radio episodes, you knew this was coming. Representation in gaming has never been something that has been historically important to me. I honestly don't care who or what the character is, white, black, male, gay, straight, a Yankees fan, it doesn't matter to me as long as they either looked cool or were well written. But I'm a huge Resident Evil fan, and by proxy that makes me like a huge horror fan. The one thing I've noticed when looking at all the horror games I've played are the distinct lack of true black leads. You might say, well, what about the three characters in the thumbnail? Yes, these are lead characters, but for all of them, it's not truly their game. They are not the star. Let me begin with the Resident Evil series, and more importantly, Sheva in Resident Evil 5. When you look at the Resident Evil series, there really isn't any notable black representation in general outside of Sheva. Most of the black characters in the mainline Resident Evil games aren't playable. Resident Evil 1, black character dies. Resident Evil 2, black character dies. Resident Evil 3, black character dies. Resident Evil 4, no black characters, so I mean, I guess that's a win. Resident Evil 5, Sheva is playable, and being that the game is co-op, she's always there. Resident Evil 6, no black characters. Resident Evil 7, black character dies. Resident Evil 8, no black characters. That's not a good track record, and I know Outbreak and Revelations have playable black characters, but I wanted to focus on the main games in this section, and more importantly, Resident Evil 5. I love Sheva, I really do. She's one of my favorite Resident Evil characters, but while she's one of the leads in this game, this is not her game, it's Chris Redfield's game. When you load up Resident Evil 5 for the first time, you can only play as Chris until you beat the game, or you get invited to a lobby where someone is playing as Chris. Once you get into the narrative, it starts with Chris's narration and arrival in Africa, it continues with Chris's search for Jill, and it ends with Chris's rivalry with Wesker. Sheva is there and she's helping, but she's playing the role of sidekick more than actually controlling the narrative, and while Chris wouldn't have stopped Wesker or even gotten nearly as far as he's gotten without her, Sheva was only in this situation because of Chris. Around the midway point of Resident Evil 5, Sheva wants to retreat, but Chris wants to press on and continue the search for Jill, and being the good partner that she is, Sheva joins Chris on his mission. There's also a bit of belief or speculation that Sheva was added later than intended due to criticisms of racism when the game was first revealed, which I don't know how true that might be, but knowing Capcom, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. I love Sheva to death, but while she's a main character, she's not the main character. How about Daymare 1998 and Samuel Walker? Daymare has you switch between three characters over the course of the game, and while Sam himself is the more interesting character, being that he's the civilian of the trio, he lives in the town where the game takes place, and he's arguably the most important character you play as, it's still not his game. You have to play as the other characters, Liev and Raven, to progress. It's not like in Resident Evil 2 where you pick which campaign you want. Every character does get a fair and healthy amount of screen time, but my point still stands. Now, to spoil the game a little bit, and I'm sorry to do this because it's such a great game, Sam suffers from these hallucinations called Daymares, and it adds an extra layer of horror to his sections of the game, as sometimes the enemies you face aren't really there. This is a unique aspect of the game that makes the tension a little higher playing as Sam, because conserving resources is key in a survival horror game. It's a major factor that goes into the science of making horror games so fun. Saga Anderson, this needs no explanation. I mean, she's in the game titled Alan Wake 2. If this was just another Remedy franchise, it's one thing, but this kind of has parallels with Sheva and Chris, where Saga, she's in Alan Wake's world. She's playing by his rules, she's helping him out. In fact, most of the characters seem to just exist to help Wake escape the dark place. Saga, she's definitely one of the cooler black characters in a horror game, and at the end of the day, she's not the real star here. Wake is. This almost feels like a slight disappointment because when you play Alan Wake, it's essentially two games running parallel to each other. How you play as Wake and how you play as Saga feels familiar yet different, and I think that's what makes Alan Wake 2 so special. But still, Saga is only in her situation because of Wake, and everything she's doing is really to help him. Now, a good example I could use is actually Lee and Clementine from the Walking Dead games. I was skeptical about this entry because The Walking Dead is a licensed IP, not an original like the others on this list, but the characters are too good to ignore. Lee is the most important character in his story. Technically, you can say it's Clementine's story because everything Lee does, he does for Clementine. You know, he wants to protect Clementine and he wants to set a good example for her. Lee is the de facto leader of his group, often being the deciding vote on major decisions and keeping everybody together as best he can. All the traits he displays and all the actions, everything he does, it influences Clementine, who takes over as the lead character for seasons 2 and 4 with a major supporting role in season 3. And similar to Lee, Clementine, despite her young age, always has a lot of influence on the people around her. The Walking Dead games aren't remembered for their gameplay, they're more focused on the dialogue and world building, but this is still the best example of black leads in a horror game. Another good example is James Savage in El Paso Elsewhere. I've spoken about this game back in chapter 69, but being that we have so few strong black leads, I should, at the very least, mention it again. El Paso is very much like Max Payne, where the gameplay is simple, but it's really the writing and character work that push it over the edge. The character of James Savage is amazing. He's a badass, tragic hero, and his narration of the game's events, his observation on the world, his humor, his stories of the past, they just really tie the game together. I cannot imagine El Paso Elsewhere is half as good without James Savage. Now, there are plenty of games out there where you have a cast of characters and you can pick which ones you want, like the Dead Island games, for example. In Dead Island 1, there are 2 black characters, Perna and Sam B, and when there's cutscenes, all the main characters appear together. Unlike in Dead Island 2, where the dialogue is the same for NPCs, and the character you play as just says whatever fits around it. Now, the subject at hand, the issue with Dead Island lies in this regard. The game is class-based, and the classes are tied to the characters as opposed to picking a class and then picking a character. Sam B's class had a focus on blunt weapons, while Perna, as an ex-cop, had a focus on firearms. This could put you in a bit of a jam, as you might like Sam B, but you want to use ranged weapons or swords, so you have to go with another character. Dead Island 2 had this same problem. There is a black character, Jacob, but I opted to go with Danny because of her class and abilities. Also, they butchered the Sam B character in Dead Island 2. It's like they made the character more stereotypical, which was very unlike him in the first game. I didn't really like that. I didn't like that one bit. But that's, that represents a larger issue when it comes to black characters. There's a huge difference between making a character who is black and making a black character, but that's for a different chapter. I mentioned Resident Evil Outbreak earlier, and yes, there's black characters, but again, this game has all the skills tied to the characters. More times than not, you're going to pick the characters with the better kits or play styles that fit you. Resident Evil Revelations, it has you play as a handful of characters over the course of the story mode. While it is primarily focused on Jill Valentine, you briefly play as Keith Lumley alongside his pal Quint Ketchum, and those two are like my favorite duo of all time. That is why you go back and replay Revelations, is just to play as those two. But Keith is only playable in a couple of chapters and is never seen again in Resident Evil. While his role was small, it was still important to the narrative. Left 4 Dead, Call of Duty Zombies, Killing Floor 2, they have black characters, but it's up to you to choose them, and in most cases, it's purely cosmetic. There's no class system in Left 4 Dead, and there's only 4 characters, so they're all going to be on screen at the same time. But I will say this, Coach, Louis, Rochelle, they're all pretty good slice-of-life black characters, especially Coach, who I feel everyone has met a Coach at some point in their life. It's just a very accurate depiction. As for Killing Floor 2, there is a class system, but thankfully it's not tied to any character. Call of Duty, the lore is slightly enhanced in Black Ops 6 based on who you pick, but again, if you're just playing for the endurance aspect of zombies, it really doesn't matter. Although it did take quite some time for zombies to get a black character, and of course the first one was a crazy old homeless man. Just to reiterate from the open, representation has never been a major selling point. I'm a black, trans, femme, baby, goth Muslim, so when I do load games up, it's cool if there's characters like me in any way, shape, or form. That's a major plus. But I'd never not buy a game or boycott a game because I wasn't pleased with the representation options offered. I also feel that just any representation in these games isn't good. Not all goths are whiny, not all Muslims or Middle Eastern people are arms dealers. They can be cool, normal people just like you or me. They just wear tall boots, or they might be fasting this month for Ramadan. I just felt that this was something that was starting to be a little glaring in a genre that I love, and I wanted to make this chapter on it. Hopefully in the near future, we get a horror game with a black lead, and it is their game from top to bottom. Alright scholars, thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know down below, how do you feel about any representation in games that you play and how important it is to you. Inshallah, I will see you in the next chapter.